Hercule Poirot and the Curse of the Unfinished Painting. Chapter 1. The Portrait Without Pupils. Lady Millicent Ravencourt's country home, nestled in the misty Devon hills, was one of those aristocratic properties that seemed frozen in time, with its ivy-covered walls, leaded glass windows, and chimneys that smoked as if guarding secrets. High Gables it was a place of both prestige and omens. That October afternoon, as a soft rain drummed against the windows, a select group of guests were having tea in the great hall, beneath the unfinished portrait that dominated the room like a shadow suspended on a canvas. It was the last work of the cursed painter, Ambrose Littingray, who had committed suicide under mysterious circumstances the very day he began painting it tore, so the legend went. The face of the woman portrayed was drawn with prodigious skill, but the pupils were absent, as if the figure a lady in an 18th century dress had no soul. Lady Millicent, seated in a high armchair with hand-embroidered cushions, maintained an expression of forced serenity. Her daughter, Evangeline Ravencourt, stood apart, leafing through a book without turning a page. Mr. Alaric Muse, an art dealer and old friend of the family, spoke enthusiastically of the work's historical value, while a young historian named Hugo Drayton took feverish notes. Near the fireplace, Miss Aleski Dubois, a French restaurateur with a sharp manner and an evasive gaze, drank her unsweetened tea. It was the butler, a dry and discreet man named Greaves, who found the body. "In the West Gallery, my lady," he announced in a subdued voice. "Mr. Godfrey has been found dead." Silence fell with the weight of an iron curtain. Godfrey Ravencourt, Lady Millicent's younger brother, was an eccentric known for his collection of curiosities, his hatred of the cursed portrait, and his fondness for Irish whiskey. He had last been seen the night before, arguing heatedly with Alaric Muse over whether the painting should be sold to the National Museum or destroyed altogether. Now he lay dead, so they would later say, on the marble floor in front of another painting, one he himself had kept, covered for years with a red cloth. It was the local doctor who declared that the cause appeared to be cardiac arrest, but also that Godfrey's face was twisted in an expression of pure terror. A clenched hand pointed toward the blurred painting, as if he had seen something impossible. The painting was still covered. No one dared to uncover it yet. "This is terrible," Lady Millicent whispered, barely audible. "First the painter, and now my brother. Is this house cursed?" The atmosphere thickened. Detective Inspector Braithwaite of the Devon Police was summoned, but he seemed more interested in practical details: what the victim ate, what time she left, who had keys to the West Wing. All these logical matters, though useful, seemed to barely scratch the surface of something deeper and darker. It was then that Lady Millicent, after a sleepless night, had a telegram sent to London. It read simply, "Urgent. I request the presence of Monsieur Hercule Poirot at High Gables. A matter of death and art. Millicent Ravencourt." 2 days later, in the middle of a pearly grey afternoon and under a rain that fell with English courtesy, a black car stopped. In front of the Rotillon gate of High Gables, short man stepped out, elegantly dressed in a pale grey coat, leather gloves, and a perfectly aligned bowler hat. His impeccably waxed moustache spoke of determination, his eyes of sharp alertness. Hercule Poirot had arrived. He was greeted by Greaves and led into the drawing-room, where Lady Millicent waited with an air of dignified despair. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, with a barely hinted bow, "I fear I have brought you into a house tainted by superstition. No, Madame Poirot replied gently. There is no superstition, only facts and, perhaps, a misinterpretation of them. Tell me, who painted that picture? Ambrose Lottengray. He committed suicide the same day he started it. Some say that the woman in the portrait was real, that she was his lover, that she died and he tried to bring her back with paint, and went mad. Poirot narrowed his eyes and approached the unfinished painting. He paused inches from the canvas, observing the absent pupils, the halted stroke, as if the painter had left something unfinished, or as if he had been interrupted by something, or someone. And now your brother, Monsieur Godfrey, dies in the presence of another painting, murmured Poirot. An interesting coincidence, isn't it? Lady Millicent trembled slightly. Poirot smiled politely. But as you know, madame, I don't believe in coincidences. Chapter 2. The Gallery of Veiled Truths. The next morning dawned with a leaden sky that seemed to carry the secrets of the night with it. The mist clung to the garden hedges like hesitant fingers, and Highgable sank into an expectant silence. In the dining room, the faint clink of china barely broke the latent tension between the diners. Poirot, perfectly dressed in his checked waistcoat and his gold-chained watch looming with mathematical precision, observed those present with the calm of someone who has already begun to measure the pace of the crime. His gaze swept over the table without needing to speak. Evangeline, with her melancholic beauty, was pouring her tea with a clumsiness that didn't fit with her refined appearance. Alaric Mews was distractedly leafing through the pages, the Times, without turning a page. Celeste Dubois was wearing gloves inside the house, which Poirot noticed without comment, and Hugo Drayton, the young historian, seemed more disturbed by the detective's presence than by the crime itself. Miss Evangeline, said Poirot suddenly, breaking the silence with the softness of a violin note, were you the last person to see Monsieur Godfrey alive? Evangeline blinked, surprised. Yes, I think so. It was late. I was in the library, and he passed by, muttering something about the real portrait and a letter he was supposed to burn. He seemed agitated. He went up to the West Gallery. I didn't see him again after that. A letter. Poirot intervened, pouring a little honey into his cup. Did he mention to whom it was addressed? No, he just said that she should never read it. I don't know if he was talking about my mother, Celeste, ... or someone else, and you didn't try to follow him. No, monsieur. Godfrey had constant mood swings. It wasn't unusual for him to withdraw without another word. Poirot nodded, his gaze now shifting to Alaric Mews. Mr. Mews, you argued with the victim on the night of her death. Was it about the painting? Alaric didn't seem surprised by the question. With a barely forced smile, he closed the newspaper. Yes, I admit it. Godfrey and I had divergent opinions about the work's value. He believed the cursed painting should be destroyed. I, as an art dealer, saw a unique piece with history, mystery, and great value. Emotion sells, Monsieur Poirot, and did he get very upset during the conversation? Godfrey often raised his voice, but it was nothing serious. He left before I could continue my argument. Poirot nodded slightly. And yet, monsieur, you also have a key to the West Wing. Is that not so, Alaric? Frowned yes, but only because Godfrey gave it to me weeks ago to inspect some parts stored there. I haven't used it since. Poirot's moustache curled slightly to one side. All right. The detective rose elegantly and asked Lady Millicent to accompany him to the West Gallery. She hesitated for a moment before agreeing, as if that part of the house had acquired an aura of repulsion since her brother's death. They walked down a dark wooden corridor, where portraits of Ravincourt ancestors hung like shadowy sentinels. Finally, they reached the gallery, a large space with tall stained glass windows and a faint smell of linseed and ancient dust. Godfrey's body had already been removed, but the red cloth still covered the painting in front of which he had died. Poirot stood before it, contemplating the scene as if he could still hear the echo of the deceased's last breath. "Has no one lifted the cloth since it was found?" asked Poirot. Lady Millicent shook her head. "I thought it was. Disrespectful. Besides, the police said it wasn't relevant." "Ah, but that depends on whose eyes look at it, madame." Poirot gently lifted the red cloth. Behind it, a disturbing portrait appeared. It showed a woman very similar to the figure in the unfinished painting, but with one fundamental difference. Her eyes were complete, and they stared at the viewer with a mixture of supplication and defiance. It was the same woman, no doubt, but alive, vibrant, too alive, perhaps. Lady Millicent shuddered. "My God, it's identical." How Poirot leaned toward the edge of the canvas. At the bottom, a faded inscription read, "For a sea revived, not resurrected." A sea, Poirot asked in a low voice. Céleste Dubois, or someone else? Lady Millicent swallowed. Ambrose Lytton Gray had a muse in his final days. Some said he loved her. He never revealed her identity, only her initials. A.C. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He went to the window, where the pale light from outside bathed the floor at an oblique angle. "Do you know, madame, what I find strangest about all this?" "What, Monsieur Poirot?" "That this portrait wasn't painted by Ambrose. It doesn't have his strokes, nor his obsession with chiaroscuro. This is the work of another hand, someone who imitated his style precisely, but failed to capture his shadow." Lady Millicent covered her mouth with a trembling hand. So it was forged, or rather, completed, by someone who needed this woman to have eyes. Poirot looked at the portrait for a long moment, then covered it. "Again with the cloth. This painting, madame, is the key, but not to a curse, but to a motive." And with that, the detective walked away silently, leaving in the air the feeling that the true crime had not yet been understood, and that the killer somehow already knew it. Chapter 3. Confessions under varnish. The afternoon hours slipped like a shadow through the corridors of High Gables, with no one daring to completely break the silence. Godfrey Ravencourt's death had left not only a physical absence, but an emotional disturbance that permeated the corners like the old varnish on a hastily restored painting. Only Poirot walked through the house with the confidence of someone who knew that everything, even the air, was capable of lying in the study attached to the library. The Belgian detective requested privacy for a series of interviews. Greaves, the butler, organized a sequence with the precision of a Swiss metronome. Poirot had requested that Céleste Dubois be the first. The French restorer entered the studio with a firm stride and an unchanging expression. Her eyes, however, reflected a restrained tension, as if she were hiding her thoughts behind an invisible veil. "Miss Dubois," Poirot began pleasantly, indicating a chair opposite his. "Tell me about the unfinished painting. What techniques did you observe when analyzing it?" "Light, very controlled brushstrokes." Ambrose was a perfectionist. He didn't allow for mistakes. He used traditional pigments, but in that painting, there was something more. A mixture of Judean, bitumen, and oil paint, she explained. An ancient technique to give depth to the contour. However, there are irregularities. Irregularities. Yes, the layers didn't dry completely. It's as if someone tried to add details long afterward, without the knowledge of the original materials. But the piece was abandoned after his death. No one was supposed to touch it, and yet she broke off. There are strokes that aren't his. I noticed it when I was cleaning the frame. Poirot crossed his fingers on his chest. And did you notify the Ravencourt family of this? No. I thought it was a disrespectful intrusion. I thought it was better not to say anything until I was certain. What if I told you there's another portrait, also of that woman, in the West Gallery? Celeste's eyes widened briefly, though her tone didn't change. I suspected as much. Godfrey once asked me to restore a covered canvas. He said I was a woman of another time who should remain hidden. I didn't insist. Poirot leaned forward. Mademoiselle, did you know Ambrose Lytton Gray personally? No, she replied immediately, but then lowered her gaze, at least. Not in the way you imagine. I only saw him once. In Paris, at an exhibition. I was a student. I admired him. He looked at me for a long time. Then he left without saying anything. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you. You may leave. When Celeste left, Poirot remained silent. For several minutes, staring at a damp patch on the wall as if it were a coded clue. Finally, he asked for Hugo Drayton, the young historian, to be summoned. Hugo entered with hurried steps and a notebook in hand. Monsieur Poirot, I'm willing to help in any way. I'm convinced that Godfrey's death was unnatural. He was a superstitious man, yes, but strong. Poirot did not smile. I'm interested in knowing what you were writing when the crime occurred. Hugo opened his notebook, somewhat confused. I was gathering background information on the Ravencourt family and Ambrose. I'm writing an essay for an academic journal. There are many contradictions in the archives, especially about a female figure who appears in his later works, the eyeless muse. And what have you discovered about her, which appears in unsigned sketches? Some believe she was invented, others that she was real and that Ambrose tried to paint her until he went mad. It's said he muttered her name in his sleep. But the most curious detail, Hugo flipped through the pages, is that a restorer with a French name appears in a letter addressed to his patron, Lord Delbridge. She touches the canvas with hands of silence. If I let her, she will complete what I cannot. Poirot narrowed his eyes, and that letter was published. No, it's in the archives of the Chelsea Art Gallery. I have a handwritten copy. I thought it was just sick poetry. Maybe it wasn't. Poirot asked to see the copy and read it in silence. For a long minute. Then, without looking up, he said, "Do you know who painted the painting hidden in the gallery?" Hugo shook his head. No. Was it Ambrose? No. It was someone who wanted to revive it, not with the truth, but with illusion. Before the young man could ask any more questions, Poirot closed the notebook and dismissed him. When the door closed, Poirot walked to the fireplace and stood there, staring intently into the fire. This wasn't the first time he had faced a crime surrounded by art. What disturbed him was not the act of killing, but the act of create something false to cover it up. He then asked to see the last of the three that afternoon. Alaric Muse, the art dealer, entered with an arrogant expression, as if he still felt he owned the story. May I assume, Mr. Muse, that you know a fake when you see one? Alaric smiled. It's part of my work. Although few are as subtle as Lytton Gray's, many have imitated him. None have equaled him. And did you try to sell any of those paintings? I won't try. But I have contacts who would be willing to pay a lot for a lost piece by the master. Of course, with due discretion, Poirot lowered his voice. What if I told you that one of those contacts already knows there's a piece, unsigned, but equally valuable? Alaric's face tensed for a second. What are you talking about? Poirot looked at him coldly. I'm talking about motives, monsieur. You knew Godfrey wouldn't allow the sale, or the display, or the restoration of anything. Perhaps that made him an obstacle. Are you suggesting? I'm considering it, Poirot said softly. Nothing more. But I advise you not to travel in the next few days. Alaric stood up abruptly. This is an offence, Monsieur Poirot. No, sir. It's a warning. When she left, Poirot was alone again, surrounded by notes, letters, and copies. Then he walked to the library, where Greaves had reserved a table for him to work. As he passed the piano, his fingers softly touched a key, out of tune. The sound made him stop. A note that doesn't fit. He muttered, sometimes that's all it takes. And with that reflection, he sat down to write Chapter 4, A Key, Out of Tune. The next day dawned, covered in a leaden light that seemed to suppress the colour of the world. The gardens of High Gables, the gardens, usually tended with aristocratic obsession, had an air of improvised abandonment, unpruned rose bushes, stopped fountains, and a silence that seemed to lurk behind the hedges. Inside, tense nerves had begun to fray morality, and even breakfast rituals were interrupted by unexplained absences, veiled whispers, and glances that avoided meeting. Poirot, however, remained faithful to his precise routine. Dressed in an impeccable, light beige suit with a purple flower in his buttonhole, he appeared in the library at 8 o'clock sharp, as promised. Greaves had left him a tray of Belgian coffee and bread rolls, as well as a sealed envelope that had been slipped under the door during the early hours. Poirot didn't touch the envelope immediately. Instead, he took a blank sheet of paper from his black leather briefcase and began meticulously drawing 3 columns. Chronology, characters, reasons under each one. He began to write in the neat handwriting of a WATCHMAKER. Chronology, Ambrose. Lytton Gray began the unfinished painting. 10 years ago. His suicide on the same day of the first session. Godfrey Ravencourt hides a second portrait. Never shown. Alaric gained access to the West Wing weeks ago. Godfrey dies in front of the hidden painting, pointing at it. Characters, Evangeline, reserved, emotionally distant. Last seen by Godfrey, Alaric, ambitious, knows about forgeries. Argued with the victim, Celeste, restaurator. Denies knowing Ambrose, but appears in letters. Hugo, historian, obsessed with the figure of the muse. Reasons, Evangeline, inheritance, protection. Of family secrets. Alaric, commercial interest in a rare piece. Celeste, artistic and possibly personal connection with Ambrose. Hugo, desire for academic fame. Obsession with legend. Then he finally opened the envelope. There was no return address, just a sheet of paper with a line written in black ink. The portrait isn't finished, because she didn't want it finished. Poirot narrowed his eyes. There was no signature, no visible fingerprints, but there was something about the stroke, a strange firmness in the handwriting, as if each letter had been deliberately separated from the one before it. A handwriting designed to conceal identity rather than communicate. He put the message in his jacket and headed to the music room. The music room of High Gables it was a jewel of Victorian design, with gilt mouldings, indigo, velvet curtains, and a jet-black beige-stained piano as its centerpiece. Poirot had noticed it on the first day, but until now he had had no reason to approach. He sat down at the piano and gently touched the same out-of-tune key he had pressed last night. The sound emerged again, a dead note cracked inside. Poirot pressed it again, then carefully lifted the top cover. Inside, he found something unusual, a folded strip of paper at the bottom of the string compartment. He carefully took it out and unfolded it. It was a sketch, in pencil, drawn with astonishing artistic skill. It depicted the same woman from the unfinished painting, but in this version her face was turned backward, as if watching someone watching her while she slept. Her eyes were open, on her back, a cross-shaped scar. Poirot watched him for a long time. A cross on the back, a symbol of hidden pain or betrayal. On the back of the drawing, an almost invisible note read, "I didn't finish it, because it wasn't mine." A note from Ambrose, or from someone trying to speak on his behalf. Poirot called Greaves and requested access to the Ravencourt family private archive, located in a small room adjacent to the library. Upon learning of this, Lady Millicent gave her permission with a mixture of reserve and resignation. "Nothing surprises me any more, Monsieur Poirot," she said before withdrawing. "But please, if you find anything, don't tell me until you're sure. My family has suffered enough from badly drawn ghosts." In the archive, Poirot found several inventory books, letters, art, purchase records, and private correspondence between Godfrey and other collectors. One folder in particular caught his eye, correspondence with Lytton Gray. In it he found a letter, signed by Godfrey. "I will never allow that face to hang on my walls again. That woman brought us misfortune, and her memory continues to haunt the frames we haven't finished burning." Poirot slowly closed the folder. Then he returned to the music room, where Greaves was waiting for him, his face paler than usual. "Monsieur Something strange has happened." "Yes. Miss Evangeline has disappeared. Her room is empty. The window is open. But the most disturbing thing, Greaves held out an object wrapped in a linen napkin. When he unfolded it, a small metal tube, stained with a dark substance, appeared. It was on her nightstand. "It looks like a tube of artist's pigment." Poirot took it and sniffed it carefully. His expression became grave. "This isn't paint. It's belladonna poison dissolved in an oily base, a trace of the past, used in the past by certain artists to dilute the pain of their models, or themselves." He looked out the open window. The oak branches creaked in the wind. "Look for her, discreetly, and no one leaves this house without my consent." Poirot took a deep breath. "Because I fear, Monsieur Greaves, that the story of this portrait is not yet finished, and may require more than one death to complete." Chapter 5. The Echo of the Torn Canvas. An hour after the alarming disappearance of Evangeline Ravencourt, High Gables It had become a nest of nervous murmurs and hushed footsteps. Doors closed a little more tightly, glances became fleeting, and even the sparrows' songs seemed muffled by the new fear floating in the air, that the unfinished portrait, more than a piece of art, was a mirror reflecting the cracks in the soul. Without losing his composure, walked through the gardens with his arms crossed behind his back. He observed with precision not the gravel paths, but the light footprints that interrupted his pace. Thin-soled marks, smaller than those of a man's shoe, wound their way toward the greenhouse at the far end of the property. Greaves followed him at a prudent distance, like a shadow that knew when not to speak. The greenhouse was covered in a layer of opaque dew. As he opened the door, a damp scent of earth, ferns, and orange blossom hit him strongly. Between the tall jasmine leaves and the orchids arranged with obsessive symmetry, Poirot made out the seated silhouette of Evangeline. "Mademoiselle," he said in a low voice, so as not to frighten her. She didn't turn around immediately. She was holding a closed notebook with a black ribbon tied around it. "I knew he'd find me," she said, her voice hollow and distant. "There aren't many places to hide in a house that watches everything." Poirot took a few more steps, without touching her. "I didn't come to judge you, miss. I came to understand you, and perhaps to prevent something irreversible from happening." She laughed, but it was a dry, joyless sound. "There are already irreversible things, Monsieur Poirot. Only no one wants to see them. Everyone talks about the unfinished painting, the painter's suicide, the value of the hidden. But no one talks about Equith, woman in the portrait, the one who wasn't finished, the one who didn't want to be finished." Poirot sat down on the stone bench opposite her. "Did you know her?" Evangeline looked down. "My father said I shouldn't talk about her, that it was a mistake, a stain on the family. But I found her letters, ... her portrait, her story." She untied the ribbon and opened the notebook. It was a diary. The pages were written in brown ink, in an irregular handwriting. Poirot didn't interrupt as she read in a low voice. "My name is Annette C., and I've been posing for Ambrose for 13 days. He won't let me speak. He says my voice breaks the balance of silence. He looks at me as if I'm trying to pry my secrets out with my eyes. I just want him to finish the portrait and let me go." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Annette C., the initials, AC in the dedication." Evangeline nodded, without looking up. "She was a governess here, many years ago, before I was born. My mother hated her. My uncle admired her. Some say Ambrose loved her, others that he used her. But the truth is, she disappeared." "Did he disappear? One night, without a trace?" "They said she returned to France. Others said she drowned in the river. But no one really looked for her. She wasn't family, just a shadow, like the one in the painting." Poirot rose slowly and offered his hand. "Miss Evangeline, is this diary recent? I found it months ago. In the false bottom of the piano, they hid it like it was poison, as if just reading it would contaminate the official story. And since then, have you painted?" She looked at him, surprised. Then she nodded slowly. "They won't let me paint. My mother calls it the wrong inheritance, but I can't help it. I see Annetta's face in my dreams. I've tried to draw it again and again, as if I wanted someone to finally finish it." Poirot sighed. "And the sketch I found on the piano, is it yours?" she started, and her face flushed with fear. "Did you find it?" "I didn't want to deceive anyone. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know if I could see her as she really was, not as others portrayed her, but as she was." Poirot bent down to his level. "Miss Evangeline, you haven't committed a crime, but others, perhaps, have. And to protect you, I need to know everything." Evangeline handed him the notebook without another word. Poirot stood up and gently escorted her back to the house. Before entering, she paused. "You know, Monsieur Poirot, last night I dreamed she was looking at me from the painting, and for the first time, she had pupils, and she was crying." Poirot didn't reply. He just offered her his handkerchief, and she took it with trembling hands. That afternoon, Poirot returned to his table in the library with Agnette's notebook before him. He read it completely, without interruption. Page after page, the governess's voice emerged like a spectre of shattered dignity. She spoke of endless painting sessions, of a house where art became a prison, of an unacknowledged daughter, and of a letter that was to be delivered when Evangeline could understand. Poirot closed the notebook solemnly. The genealogical line of High Gables, he thought, had more ramifications than the files showed, and not all of them were dead. At dusk, he summoned Celeste Dubois once more. This time, it wouldn't be an interview. It would be a meeting. The penultimate in a game that still had a queen hidden behind the veil of the canvas. Chapter 6. The Hand That Painted Silence. Celeste Dubois arrived at the library as night fell, her steps firm and her lips pursed, as if she expected condemnation rather than conversation. Poirot was waiting for her by the fireplace, hatless this time, with Annette's diary closed on a mahogany tray. The desk lamp cast a warm light on the Persian rug, and the clocks on the wall struck 10 with the solemn rhythm of someone who knows that time sometimes also lies. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot, bowing slightly, "thank you for coming. I have a few questions that require less technique and more memory." Celeste didn't sit down immediately. She scanned the room as if searching for an invisible escape route. "Memory? Sir, mine tend to be selective." "I imagine so. But there are things that even the most deliberate memories can't bury." He slid the notebook toward her. "Do you recognize this writing?" Celeste didn't move. She just stared at the object as if it were burning. "Where did you find it?" "In the piano, hidden in a compartment that hasn't been opened for years. The ink is faded, but not enough to obscure the truth." She closed her eyes. "Annette's. Did you know her?" Celeste nodded slightly, and for the first time her voice broke. "She was my older sister." The silence in the library became total. Even the clocks seemed to stop for a moment. Poirot did not seem surprised. "I suspected as much. Its resemblance to the sketch was too close to be a coincidence. My family disowned her. My father was a bankrupt sculptor. My mother was a housekeeper in Marseille. Annette dreamed of painting. She came to England as a governess for the Raven Courts. She never told me directly, but I know she loved Ambrose, and that he betrayed her. And you, mademoiselle, did you also come for love?" Celeste looked at him, and for the first time her eyes were not cold or calculating, but immensely sad. "I came for justice, to rescue her name from oblivion, to see if anything remained, any trace of her within these walls." Poirot walked slowly towards the shelves. "Were you the one who painted the hidden portrait?" She hesitated. "Not quite. Godfrey showed it to me one night, in secret. He said it was an aberration, that it should never have existed. But I saw my sister in that canvas. I saw her fear, her desire to be recognized. I begged him to let me restore it. He told me that if I touched it, I would destroy it. So I worked in secret. A few strokes here, a few there, little by little. But I never signed it. And when did you complete it? I never did, because I couldn't complete it. Every time I added something, the more unfinished it seemed." Poirot approached her and spoke with the sweetness of a priest in confession. "And it was you who sent the note. The portrait isn't finished, because she didn't want it finished." Celeste shook her head. "No, that handwriting isn't mine." Poirot tilted his head slightly, one possibility ruled out, and another emerging more clearly. and belladonna, belladonna, the tube found next to Evangeline's bed. It looked like pigment, but it wasn't. An ancient preparation. Lethal if applied to the skin, and even more so if ingested. Celeste was startled. I wouldn't do that. Evangeline is. She's part of Annette. If Ambrose was cruel, if the Ravencourt silenced her, Evangeline is all that's truly left of my sister. Poirot let out a slight sigh. So, mademoiselle, I must ask you, who else knew about your relationship with Annette? Celeste hesitated. Godfrey sensed it. He interrogated me constantly. He followed me around the house. He didn't trust me. He threatened to reveal that I wasn't a certified restorer, that I had lied to get into High Gables. And why didn't he leave? Because Annette couldn't do it, and I wasn't willing to abandon her a second time. Poirot moved away from the fireplace and walked to the window. Outside, the rain was beginning to beat insistently against the panes. So you think Godfrey was murdered by someone who wanted to keep Annette's secret buried? Celeste looked down. Or by someone who thought that revealing that secret endangered something more valuable than the truth? Poirot turned to her. Like what? Like an inheritance, a reputation, a last name. Poirot nodded gravely. A noble family can accept unfinished paintings, but not unacknowledged daughters. When Celeste left, Poirot remained in the library, thoughtful. In his notebook, he drew a new diagram, this time not with columns, but with concentric circles. In the center, he wrote the name Annette C. Around him, he drew names in a spiral. Ambrose, Godfrey, Celeste, Evangeline, Millicent. On the outermost edge, he wrote one more colon, Alaric, dot, and beyond them all, in darker ink, a single word, paper, the letter Godfrey had mentioned on the night of his death, the one that was to be burned. Poirot stood up and called Greaves. A question, monsieur, he said in a low voice. Have you checked the contents of the fireplace in the west gallery? Yes, monsieur. Poirot, we found fresh ashes, but among them something else. An unbroken wax seal, with initials, yes, AC. Poirot smiled mirthlessly. So, dear Greaves, I think it's time to get everyone together. Chapter 7. Meeting under indirect light. The appointed time was 8 o'clock by express order of Hercule Poirot. All the inhabitants of High Gables, they were summoned to the main hall, the same one where the infamous unfinished painting hung, its pupils absent and its beauty suspended in a frozen gesture. No one protested. No one dared. The atmosphere in the mansion had changed. It was no longer one of mourning, but of waiting. And at the center of that waiting was the Belgian detective, whose absolute calm was beginning to seem, to some, disturbingly supernatural. Poirot stood by the fireplace, perfectly erect, his hands folded in front of him, a sealed envelope in one hand and Annette's notebook in the other. Beside him, a small mantel clock ticked away the seconds with tic-tacs oft, relentless. My lords and ladies, he began in a soft but firm voice, I thank you for your presence. I know these past few nights have been difficult, and I fear the coming hours will be no less intense. But it is necessary that, finally, the truth speak, because here, in this room, beneath this painting, lies have been told for too long, and lies, like false brushstrokes, soon crumble. Evangeline, sitting next to Lady Millicent, had a pale face, her hands clasped tightly. Celeste stood in the background, her eyes fixed on the portrait. Alaric Muse nervously tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair. Hugo Drayton, notebook in hand, didn't dare write. Greaves, discreet as ever, kept watch from the doorway. "Let's begin," said Poirot, holding up Annette's notebook. "This is the voice of a forgotten woman. Annette C. was a governess in this house more than 2 decades ago. She was talented, sensitive, and the muse of the painter Ambrose Lighton-Gray. She was also the mother of a daughter whose Ravencourt blood was never acknowledged, a daughter who grew up under the burden of a surname she could not name. That daughter is you, Mademoiselle Evangeline." A murmur broke out in the room. Lady Millicent clutched a hand to her chest, as if she had been hit by an invisible projectile. "That's impossible," she exclaimed. I'm his mother." Poirot looked at her gently, but without yielding. "No, madame. You raised her. You even protected her. But you didn't bring her into the world. It was a decision made in the name of honor, of scandal, perhaps even of love. But Annette's diary is clear, and so is the sketch hidden in the piano. Ambrose portrayed her not only as a lover, but as a mother." Lady Millicent slumped in her seat, unable to deny, but also unable to nod. "Godfrey Ravencourt knew the truth," Poirot continued. "He knew it years ago. He knew it when he saw the hidden portrait. He knew it when he heard the name Annette from Celeste Dubourg. And he knew it when he found the letter Ambrose left, addressed not to him, nor to Lady Millicent, but to his daughter, Evangeline. He then took out the sealed envelope with the initials AC. This seal was found among the ashes of the fireplace in the West Gallery. They tried to burn it, yes, but they didn't completely succeed. And inside, still legible, was Ambrose Lighton-Gray's last wish, that his daughter know the truth, that she not grow up believing herself to be just another shadow in the house. The silence was total. Only the faint crackling of the fire could be heard. Poirot turned slowly towards Alaric Mews. "You, sir, had reason to wish that letter would disappear. Such a truth would have ruined the sale of the painting. No one pays a fortune for a royal curse, especially not one accompanied by scandal, that proves nothing." Alaric retorted, now on his feet, his face flushed. "I didn't kill Godfrey. No, sir, he didn't kill him with his own hands. But he pushed him. He cornered him. He threatened to expose Celeste as an impostor. He blackmailed him into selling the hidden portrait on his own. Godfrey was unstable, yes, but not crazy, and on that night, under her pressure, he made the decision to take the letter out and burn it himself." Poirot turned to Celeste. "You saw him enter the gallery. You followed him. You argued. He mocked. He told you that your sister would remain just cursed paint. And you took the tube of pigment you had with you and mixed it with belladonna, but not to kill him, just to scare him, so he would believe the painting was really poisonous." "No," Celeste cried, trembling. "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted him to feel fear, like Annette felt." Poirot nodded sadly. "I know, but in his altered state, with his weak heart, it was enough. The combination of the poison and the shock knocked him down, and he fell, pointing at the portrait." Evangeline stood up slowly. "So, all this was about a woman they denied, about a letter, about an incomplete portrait." Poirot approached her. "No, all of this was due to something even deeper, the inability of the living to do justice to the dead." The young woman closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "And now, mademoiselle, the truth must be revealed. Not in the courts, perhaps, but in the soul." Poirot turned to Greaves. "Call the police. not to punish, but to put things in order. And then, approaching the unfinished portrait, he whispered to himself, "Maybe we can finally add pupils." Chapter 8. The Pupils of Memory. The next morning, he emerged in high gables like a freshly primed canvas, still unmarked, silent, and waiting for a hand that knew how to trace the lines of truth. The previous night storm had left its mark on the wet leaves in the garden and the steamed-up windows, but inside the house the air was different. Something had changed, though it wasn't yet clear whether it was relief, or resignation. Came down to breakfast later than usual, escorted by the muffled sound of his own footsteps and the faint fragrance of the coffee Greaves had carefully prepared. The butler, paler than usual, wordlessly handed him a note. "Thank you, mon ami," said Poirot, sitting down slowly and smoothing the folds of the tablecloth with a ritual gesture. The note was brief. "I've spoken with the local police. They won't be filing any immediate charges. Miss Dubois is under voluntary surveillance. Evangeline has asked to stay at the house for a few more days." Inspector Braithwaite. Poirot closed the note with a slight nod. Justice had taken its own course, though, as always, slower and less elegant than he would have liked. But some things couldn't be rushed. Not the drying of a coat of oil, not the healing of a wound that's in one's name. He finished his breakfast meticulously, then asked to see Evangeline. He found her in the painting studio, a room that had been closed for years and that now, for the first time in a long time, breathed. Evangeline wore a pigment-stained white apron and stood in front of the unfinished canvas. The painting, having been carefully brought down from the great hall, now rested on an antique easel. The light from the window fell directly on the portrait's face, in that curve where her eyes should have been, but weren't yet. "I didn't think I'd be allowed to touch it," Evangeline said without turning round. But Lady Millicent didn't stop me. She just said, "Do what you feel is right." Poirot approached slowly. The palette rested on a low table. Beside it, an open sketchbook showed several attempts at completing the face. All different, none definitive. "And what do you feel, mademoiselle?" Evangeline was slow to respond. I'm afraid. Not of failing, but of getting it right. Because if the eyes appear, she'll no longer be a symbol. She'll be someone. And then no one will be able to deny her any more." Poirot was silent for a moment. Then, with great delicacy, he took a chair and sat down. "When I was young, before I became a detective, I dreamed of being a locksmith," he said suddenly. She turned around, surprised. "Locksmith?" "Yes, I was fascinated by the idea of opening what others considered lost. But then I realized that not all locks are on doors. Some are in souls, and they aren't opened with keys, but with truths." Evangeline looked at him with an indefinable expression. Then she returned her gaze to the canvas. "What if I don't understand her? What if I paint what I believe, and not what she was?" Poirot raised a finger. "Mademoiselle, every portrait is an interpretation, even those by the great masters. The important thing is not whether the truth is complete, but whether it is honest." She took a deep breath. Then she dipped her brush into a mixture of burnt umber with a light touch of emerald green. She applied it patiently and hurriedly. Her hand trembled, but only at first. Poirot watched her make the first stroke on the empty space, a soft curve, then a thicker line outlining the shadow of an iris. For almost half an hour, the studio was a sanctuary of silence. When she finished, Evangeline dropped the brush. I don't know if I did it right. Poirot approached, slightly inclining his head. Towards the portrait, there were the eyes. Not perfect, not identical to a salon portrait, but alive, profound, slightly sad, as if they knew everything that had happened, and forgave him. You did very well, mademoiselle, Poirot said quietly, because at last she can look back. That evening, Poirot asked not to be interrupted in the library. With the lamp dimmed and a blank sheet of paper in front of him, he wrote a letter, not to the police, not to a museum, but to Ambrose Littengray himself. Sir, the art you didn't finish has been completed, but not with your technique, nor with your genius, but with something stronger, the living memory of those who still have the courage to look at what others fear. There is no curse on your painting, only a story, badly told. Today, that story has begun to be corrected. He signed his initials and placed the sheet of paper inside Annette's diary, now sealed and ready to be sent to the National Archives, where her story would finally be recorded. Closing the notebook, Poirot murmured, "Not all works should remain unfinished," and with that, he turned off the lamp. Chapter 9. The Frame That Never Fit. Poirot's penultimate day in High Gablesdon had a restrained air, as if the house itself knew something was closing in, but not entirely. The wind stirred the curtains with gentle but insistent fingers, as if still searching for an unrevealed gap, a corner not swept away by logic. Even though the crime seemed solved and the truth had taken shape on the canvas, Poirot knew with the certainty that only the small grey cell scan grant that there were still loose ends, and one of them, curiously, was the most visible of all. The frame. Poirot walked silently down the West Wing corridor, with the ritual tranquility of a priest, on his last procession before retirement. The gallery was still sealed, but the key now hung in his own pocket, and inside. The hidden painting, the first to show Annette with pupils, hung above the fireplace, wrapped in the red cloth with which Godfrey had covered it for years. Greaves accompanied him discreetly. "Do you want me to remove the cloth, sir?" "No, thanks. I just need to observe." They entered. The space had the dimness of a confession room. The unlit fireplace seemed like a cold altar. Poirot advanced to the draped portrait and examined the frame. Not the painted face, but the edge. The gilt frame was worn at the corners, but not from time, from rubbing, from frequent movement. Poirot stroked the moulding with his fingertips. A crack on the right, a slight separation between the wood and the canvas. "This frame isn't the original, Greaves." "No, sir." "No," Poirot repeated, "and it hasn't been lovingly adapted. It's been imposed, forced." He took out his pocket-knife, with extreme care, and slid the tip along the edge of the canvas, where the fabric met the frame. A faint click, a hidden paper. He carefully extracted it. It was a letter, carefully folded and wrapped in a silk handkerchief. When he opened it, he revealed a text written in pencil, in a nervous handwriting. The ink, faded by time and friction, was still legible, for whoever finds it. "This portrait isn't of Annette." "Not exactly. It's of the woman Ambrose thought he saw, not who she was. I finished it because he couldn't, but every brush stroke I added was a betrayal. If anyone asks, I wasn't an artist. I was a witness, and what I saw must not be repeated. H." Poirot frowned. H. No Celeste, no Ambrose, no Godfrey. H. Hours later, in the greenhouse, Poirot found Hugo Drayton. The young historian was compulsively flipping through his notebook, as if trying to read not what he had written, at what he had left out. "Monsieur Drayton," Poirot said politely, "I would appreciate a few minutes of your time and your memory." "About what, Monsieur Poirot?" "About history, but not the written kind, the lived kind." Hugo swallowed. "Are you accusing me?" "No, sir, I'm inviting you to confess, or to explain if you prefer." Hugo sat down, suddenly pale. "I found the painting 3 years ago. It was during my first summer here as a guest of the family. They allowed me to search the archives. I found an old mention of the portrait hidden in an unsigned letter. It haunted me. When I finally got to see it, I knew it was incomplete. But I also knew I had no right to touch it, and yet he did it." "I did it," Hugo said, lowering his head. "I finished it, or tried to. I added the pupils, the details of the face. Then Godfrey came in. He found out. He was furious. He said I'd desecrated a grave, but I didn't do it for the money, or for fame. I did it because I needed to see her. Because she looked at me in my dreams. The woman in the portrait. I don't know who she really was, but I felt like if I didn't complete her, she'd keep staring at me with those vacant eyes. It was crazy, maybe, but real to me." Poirot looked at him with a mixture of compassion and impeccable logic. "It was you who sent the anonymous note." Hugo nodded with the shame of a child who had unwittingly given himself away. "I didn't want anyone else to complete something I had already tainted." Poirot stood up. "What you did wasn't a crime. It was an act of, how can I put it, romantic desperation. But it left its mark, and those marks altered everyone's perception, even Godfrey's own. Did I kill him? Not with his hands. But he led him to the scene, where, perhaps out of fear or guilt, his heart couldn't resist. He fell victim to a painting that should never have been finished so many times, and by so many hands. That evening, Poirot wrote a new line in his notebook. The painting is no longer one. It's 3. Ambrose's, Hugo's, and Evangeline's. And in each version, the woman is different. Because memory, like art, is never neutral. The next day, Poirot packed his luggage. Lady Millicent saw him off with a serene, though tired, expression. Evangeline hugged him wordlessly. Celeste handed him a small box. Inside, a quill pen belonging to her sister, wrapped in blue velvet. It was the only tool Annette kept from her previous life, she said. Thank you for returning her, in some way, to the place that was taken from her. Poirot, with his walking stick and his suitcase perfectly aligned, got into the car without looking back. Only when the car began to pull away did he take a photograph of the final portrait out of his pocket. He looked at it for several minutes. 3 versions of the same woman, he murmured. Who was she really? The muse, the mother, the daughter. And then, with a slight smile, maybe she was just someone who wanted to be remembered. Chapter 10. The silence that signs the portrait. 2 weeks after leaving High Gables, Hercule Poirot found himself in his London apartment, perfectly arranged. As always, the window-sill without a speck of dust, the slippers lined up like soldiers in a row, the vase of fresh gardenias. On the desk, a letter awaited, freshly arrived, bearing the Devon stamp and the firm handwriting of Lady Millicent Ravencourt. Poirot opened it wearing cotton gloves, as if every word he was about to read might be broken by direct contact with his skin. Mr. Poirot, since her departure, the house has changed. Or perhaps we have. The finished portrait now hangs in the music room, where no one dares to raise their voice. Evangeline spends hours in front of it, painting in silence. Not copies of her face, but more abstract things. A bridge in the rain, a nameless field, an empty chair. She says she can finally paint without looking back. Celeste has returned to Marseille. She left without any drama, but she left me a letter apologizing. Not for what she did, but for what she could never protect. I understand her now more than I'd like to admit. As for me, I'm trying to make peace with a story I didn't write, but in which I was complicit by omission. Your visit, Monsieur Poirot, forced us to look beyond the gilded frame. I am more grateful to you for that than for any revealed truth. Poirot left the letter next to the vase and poured himself a cup of Darjeeling tea with his usual ritual of 3 precise movements. As the steam rose, he allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, but only for a few moments. Then he went to the filing cabinet and took out a folder labeled Case, the Curse of the Unfinished Painting. Inside, the documents were organized by section: police reports, letters, photographs, personal notes. But on the back, carefully inserted between 2 blank sheets, was a copy of the final portrait. Not a photograph, a miniature reproduction, painted with gouache on paper. A reproduction sent by Evangeline. What caught his attention was nothing. Facey already knew it by heart. What he had added in the lower margin, in blue ink, a signature. A.C. Poirot looked at her for a long time. Curious, he murmured. A signature that doesn't belong to the painter, but to the model. Or perhaps ... to the daughter. Or to both. The painting, he thought, hadn't been signed by the person who finished it, but by the person who inspired it. And perhaps that was only right. Let the story close with the initials that had floated for so long among shadows, truncated notes, and echoless sighs that afternoon. Poirot had one last unexpected visitor, Hugo Drayton. The young man arrived nervously, hat in hand, his expression somewhere between guilt and relief. He had requested an audience with a smudged card and a brief note. Just 5 minutes, Monsieur Poirot, nothing more. Poirot received him with his usual courtesy. 5 minutes exactly, Mr. Drayton, not one more, not one less. Hugo smiled nervously. I came to say goodbye. I'm going to Italy, a scholarship to study Renaissance portraits. I want to get away from the case for a while, and from myself, I guess. Poirot nodded understandingly. Looking for oneself in other people's museums is a rather civilized way of escaping. Do you think it was all in vain? What I did? What I tried to complete? No, I think it was confusing, as is everything done out of misunderstood love. But I also think that his strokes, though misguided, opened a crack, and through that crack the truth entered. Hugo looked down. She write to me, do you think? Miss Ravencourt has her own canvas now. If she decides to write to you, it will be because she's decided to include you in her painting. Not as the protagonist, but perhaps as a faint trace in the background. Hugo stood up, bowed slightly, and left. That night, Poirot turned on his reading lamp, not to review a case, but to look at a photograph. Not of the crime, not of the suspects, but of the final scene. The woman's face, Evangeline's. Annette stared at him, eyes filled with something he couldn't quite define. Gratitude, sadness, resignation. Maybe it was just memory. And then, as if the thought had come to him from elsewhere, Poirot muttered, there is no perfect crime, but there are portraits that look too much like the truth. And he closed the file, not to forget it, but to give him rest. Chapter 11. The Silent Gallery. 5 years later, the mist once again descended upon the Devon hills, curling between the trees like an old cat, returning to the lap where it learned to dream. High gables, restored but not altered. It retained its melancholic dignity, its stone washed by the seasons, and its roof renovated, yet faithful to its ancient lines. But something had changed. The house was no longer a relic I feared to remember. It was a space that held memory. Without fear, in the east wing, where a rarely used reading room had once stood, there now stood a small, intimate art gallery, which the press had dubbed with a mixture of reverence and surprise. The incomplete portrait gallery, not because of the central painting, which now looked complete, but because of what it represented, a story told in layers, like the invisible strata of an oil painting worked on for years by multiple hands, multiple pains, and a truth that no one had been willing to see with open eyes. Evangeline Ravencourt, now a serene woman with hair slightly greying at the temples, welcomed a small group of guests. She wore raw linen, unadorned, and walked with the confidence of someone who no longer needs permission to exist. Among the attendees, discreet collectors, fine arts students, and the occasional mild-mannered journalist, was a guest with no name on the list, but with an invitation that went beyond all protocol. Hercule Poirot, he entered unannounced, his dark coat draped over his shoulders, his stiff-brimmed hat draped over his shoulders, and carrying a cane he didn't need but used, as if each step were part of a private choreography. Beside him, Greaves, now retired but still standing, led him to the gallery without another word. "I was waiting for you," Evangeline said when she saw him. "I don't doubt it," Mademoiselle Poirot replied with a slight bow. "But I didn't come out of nostalgia. I came to see if finally history has run its course." She smiled barely. "Some pigments take a lifetime." They walked together down the short hallway that led to the painting. The room had white plaster walls. A natural light filtered through softly hued stained glass windows. No label described the canvas. No plaque explained its origin. Only the portrait. There it was, the woman with pupilless eyes. Now complete, neither young nor old, neither muse nor mother, just a woman with a face full of secrets already forgiven. At the base, above the restored frame, a single word carved in pale wood, memory. Poirot watched him silently. He took a step closer. Then he spoke in a low voice, almost to himself. "The perspective has changed." Evangeline nodded. "Years ago, we looked at her from the outside, like someone studying a mystery. Now she looks at us, as if she already knew all our versions. And you accept them." "I think so." They sat on the bench in front of the portrait. For a few minutes they shared a thought-filled silence, and Annette's diary. Poirot asked finally, "Donated?" "To the National Archives, but digitized, accessible to anyone who wants to read it, even to those who don't believe in it. History doesn't ask to be believed, just to never be silenced again." Poirot smiled, not with joy, but with a satisfaction, as polished as the edge of an antique mirror. "And Mr. Drayton? In Florence, he's become a professor. He writes to me sometimes. He says he doesn't dream of portraits anymore, only of landscapes." "A considerable improvement," murmured Poirot. She turned to him gently. "You once said that portraits aren't finished, that they're abandoned. And this one, do we abandon it or do we finish it?" Poirot thought for a few seconds. "Neither one nor the other. This portrait has redeemed itself." "It's different then." With characteristic precision, He pulled a small envelope from his inside pocket. Inside, carefully preserved, was a handwritten note. This was found in my files a few weeks ago. I kept it without knowing why, but now I think it belongs to you. Evangeline read it. It was a fragment of a sketch, signed with Ambrose's initials. It read, "There is a face I cannot paint. Not because I don't remember, but because I'm afraid to paint it with too much love and too little." Truth. She closed her eyes. He also knew that the image was not enough. "Exactly," said Poirot, rising. "Justice, mademoiselle, is not always done with scales. Sometimes it is done with paintbrushes, and you have done it." He said goodbye with a slight bow, more ceremonious than affectionate, and headed toward the exit unhurried, as if the steps on his way back had the same value as those on his way home. Before crossing the threshold, he turned one last time toward the portrait, and for a moment, just when he thought he saw the woman in the painting, blink, not physically, not on the canvas, but within the collective memory of all those who, for years, dared not to look at her at all. Poirot, as always, did not believe in ghosts, only in poorly spoken truths, and that, finally, had been pronounced. Chapter 12. The painting that learned to keep silent. The night before his final return to London, Hercule Poirot stayed in a modest inn in the village of Dunscombe. A few miles from High Gables. It wasn't typical for him to choose lodgings without embroidered carpets or well-tuned pendulum clocks, but that night he wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking, in his own secret way, for silence. The dining room was empty except for an elderly couple who weren't speaking to each other and a young woman sketching in the corner, tracing shadows with a pencil on a folded sheet of paper. Poirot settled himself at a table near the fireplace. He took out his pocket watch, placed it on the table, and watched it strike 9 without a sound. He stopped it with a gentle gesture, as if granting time a respite. 5 years had passed. Yes, but the echoes of the case, of the unfinished painting, or more precisely, of the unfinished heart still left traces in his thoughts. Because, as he had sensed from the beginning, what was revealed in High Gables it wasn't a murder, but something more elusive, a fragmented confession spread across generations and paintings. A crime without a crime, but with an invisible victim. "The truth, Mr. Poirot." The innkeeper's voice interrupted his reflection. "Yes, my friend, you have a visitor, a young woman. She hasn't given her name." Poirot raised an eyebrow, and he let her in. "He's already waiting for you in the small living room." Poirot stood up immediately, feeling a tingling sensation that wasn't entirely surprising. He entered the living room, where a grandfather clock had stopped ticking at 11. And there, sitting by an oil lamp, was Evangeline Ravencourt. She wasn't dressed with the formality of an inauguration, nor with the tension of her first days, under suspicion. She was simple, without makeup, without ornaments, just her. I looked it up in High Gables. They told me he was gone. I assumed he'd left without saying goodbye. Poirot bowed slightly. "Goodbye, mademoiselle, is sometimes unnecessary when the whole story has been told." She smiled. "Not entirely. There's still something left. Something I think you should see." She took a folder out of her bag. Inside was a thick sheet of paper with rough edges and a new painting. Not a portrait, not a figure, but a scene. An empty art studio bathed in light from an open window. In the center, a canvas covered with red fabric. In the background, a blurred figure emerged from a door, leaving wet footprints on the floor, Poirot watched her for a long time. A metaphor, no, a memory. The last one I have of my real mother, Annette. I don't know if it was real. I don't know if I saw it or dreamed it, but I painted it. And in doing so, I felt closer to her than in any archive, letter, or testimony. Poirot touched the edge of the sheet. And have you signed this time? No. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he already knew. Then you no longer need to prove anything. Not to her, not to yourself. Evangeline sighed. And you, Monsieur Poirot, have you ever wanted to sign something that wasn't a case? Poirot smiled, this time warmly. I sign with what I leave intact, mademoiselle. Not with what I discover. She stood up and put the painting away. Then I think this is in good hands. And you, what will you do now? I'll continue painting, but without the need to complete the incomplete. I'm content with suggesting, with opening up spaces. Not all paintings need pupils. No, said Poirot. Some people learn to look, precisely because they've never really looked. She kissed him on the cheek respectfully and quietly left the room. Poirot did not stop her. He stared at the lamp. Then he walked back to the dining room, where his watch was still stopped at 9. He didn't wind it again. He just put it away. The innkeeper offered him more tea. Everything well, sir? A story has found its end. And that's strange to you. Poirot smiled sadly. The strange thing, my friend, is when that ending doesn't require an arrest or an accusation. Just silence. In the following days, Poirot didn't write any reports. He didn't file any documents. He didn't add this case to his list of triumphs, because it wasn't a case. It was an echo, a figure slowly emerging from the shadows, and vanishing just when one thought one saw it complete. And in some corner of the detective's meticulous heart, that idea remained. There are paintings that are never finished because they are alive, and that justice, sometimes, is allowing them to keep breathing. Chapter 13, where the light touches first. A year later, on a misty April morning, a solitary visitor climbed the hill to St. Ethelrida's church, on the outskirts of Devon. The place, forgotten by most, had a side chapel with antique stained glass, windows that filtered the light with a silence that didn't belong to this century. It wasn't a place of pilgrimage, but it was a place of contemplation. Hercule Poirot climbed the last steps with the same precision with which he had solved crimes throughout his life, without haste, without detours, and with the elegance of someone who fears not the end, but carelessness. In his hands he carried a small walnut box, without a lock. He had been invited though he didn't recognize it as such, by a letter that had arrived weeks earlier, written in Evangeline slanted handwriting. It didn't say much, only they installed the stained glass window. It doesn't seem like a tribute to me, more like a tribute, and at the end, I think you should see it. You found it more than anyone. Poirot, sitting on a bench near the entrance, leisurely removed his gloves. He waited. Then he stood up and walked to the side altar. There, covering the eastern wall of the chapel, a new stained glass window shone with a strange glow in the morning light. It was not a religious image. It was a female figure, standing in front of a white canvas. She wasn't painting. She wasn't praying. She wasn't crying. She was just observing. Behind her, a field of withered lilies, and, in the sky, an unfinished line, the outline of a barely drawn signature, fading before closing. There was no name inscribed, nor a date. but at the base of the stained glass, on the lead, a phrase engraved. In Latin, memories that give themselves up. The memory that announces itself. Poirot remained still for a long time. He wasn't looking for clues. He wasn't looking for mistakes. Just something he'd learned hard, acceptance. When he sat down again, he opened the walnut box. Inside there were 3 objects. A clipping from Annette's diary, with a passage underlined. By Evangeline, there are times when living without being seen hurts more than dying remembered. An antique pen, without ink, wrapped in a purple ribbon. A miniature portrait, painted by Evangeline, not of Annette, not of Ambrose, not of Godfrey, but of a girl in an open field, looking down at a still empty canvas. Poirot placed them, one by one, on the stone bench in front of the stained glass window. A few steps behind, the voice of an older woman, a caretaker of the place, rose softly. "Were you a friend of the artist?" Poirot did not turn around. "No, I witnessed the painting." She nodded, as if she understood more than she let on. "No one comes here much, but every now and then a woman comes alone. She sits, doesn't speak, then she leaves. Sometimes she leaves wildflowers, and you don't ask who she is." "Does it matter?" Poirot smiled. "No, in fact, that's part of justice. Not asking, just looking, and remembering. By the time he left the church, the light had cleared. The Devon fields shimmered with the ripe green of early spring, and the sky seemed in no hurry to close. In the distance, a group of children played with sketchbooks. One clumsily traced an eyeless figure, another added a face. Without judgment, without fear, Poirot watched them for a moment. Then he picked up his walking stick again, adjusted his coat, and began walking down the hill. Reaching the main path, he turned around one last time. The stained glass window still shone brightly from a distance, as if it knew someone was looking at it, and maybe within that motionless image, someone was also looking back. Chapter 14. The Unsigned Echoes. When Poirot returned to London a few days after his visit to Devon, the fog over the Thames seemed to have been waiting for him. It felt like an echo of stained glass, translucent, melancholic, full of shapes that could almost be touched, but that offered no resistance. In his small apartment in Whitehaven Mansions, the Belgian detective sat by the fireplace with a new, unopened notebook. He wasn't writing yet. He was observing. "Monsieur Poirot," said George, his faithful valet, entering with a tray of tea and apricot rolls, "are you planning to reopen any cases? I dare suggest something more, contemporary, perhaps a bank swindle, something that doesn't involve portraits, or ghosts." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ghosts, Georges, is that what you think we solved?" "No, monsieur. But you will admit that the case at Ravencourt Hall was more ethereal than usual." Eternal, yes. Ethereal, not so much. Human emotions, Georges, even the most delicate, always leave traces. Only sometimes, not on the ground, but in the eyes of others. George, as was his custom, didn't argue. He placed the tea down and withdrew with dignity. Poirot leafed through the case papers, not because he needed to remember them, but because he knew there were still unanswered questions. Not about culpability. Annette Ravencourt had been the victim of a chain of veiled acts. Yes, but the circle had closed. What Poirot didn't understand yet was ... because the final stained glass window depicted a young girl in place of the forgotten adult woman, a half-finished signature, a memory returned to childhood. The answer, Poirot sensed, was not at Ravencourt Hall, but with someone who hadn't spoken yet. 2 weeks later, Poirot requested a meeting with Lady Miranda Elridge at her private residence in Mayfair. She had been one of Evangeline's childhood friends. She had attended the fateful dinner, and above all, she had said very little. The lady greeted him with distant courtesy. A woman with perfectly combed white hair, a sharp gaze, and lips that seemed always ready to pass judgment. "Monsieur Poirot," she said as she poured the tea, "I'm surprised by your visit. Haven't you already solved the mystery? Maybe the crime, not the memory." Lady Elridge watched him with interest. "Memory is more dangerous than blood, monsieur, and much harder to erase." Poirot nodded. "Why the girl in the stained glass window?" The question was direct. Lady Elridge didn't pretend surprise, because Evangeline didn't paint the truth. She painted the wounds. Poirot inclined his head. Whose girl was it? The pause was minimal. It was Annette, or rather, what was left of her before she was called by her name. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Before Annette. You think the tragedy began with her arrival at Ravencourt? You're wrong. It began earlier, in an orphanage in Sussex. A child with no name, no known parents, no voice, until someone, a lady named Beatrix Lonsdale, a distant relative of the Ravencourts, brought her to the estate with an ambiguous note and left her there as a ward. Poirot leaned forward. "Do you know what that note said?" Lady Elridge stood with difficulty. She opened a glass box on the mantelpiece and took out an old sheet of paper, carefully laminated. She handed it over without a word. Poirot read, "This is the silence that belongs to me. Don't look for its origin. Teach him to paint. It's the only thing he remembers without pain." There was no signature. "Where did you get this, madame?" "Evangeline gave it to me years ago. She said if anyone ever asked, I should show it. But not before." Poirot leaned back. The cogs in his mind, silent but relentless, were beginning to chart new paths. So painting wasn't an expression of talent. It was a way of retaining what couldn't be said. Lady Elridge sat down, more tired than before. "And you, monsieur, what do you plan to do with this truth? Annette is dead. Evangeline too. Godfrey fell for his own lies. And the portrait, well, the portrait was never finished." Poirot stood up. "But the painting exists. In the eyes of those who looked at it without seeing it." He left without another word. In his pocket was the unsigned note, and in his mind, for the first time, a name had begun to form. That night, in his apartment, Poirot began to write a letter to whom it may concern at the National Orphan Archive for the South of England, I am, requesting access to the records of the Beatrix Lonsdale home in Sussex between 1888 and 1894. I am seeking documentation of an unidentified child, surrendered under irregular circumstances. It is believed she was rehomed under the name Annette around 1893. My concern isn't judicial, it's humanly urgent. Sincerely, Poirot. When he finished, Poirot leaned back in his chair. He wasn't looking for culprits. He was restoring a lost fragment, because what was missing in the unfinished painting was not a stroke or a color. It was a name, one that was never spoken, and that, if memory was right, it should be returned. Chapter 15. The words that were left unsaid. It was a cold London evening when Captain Hastings, wrapped in a brown wool coat, and with his moustache slightly covered in dew, knocked on the door of the apartment at Whitehaven Mansions. He hadn't seen Poirot for several weeks since, before the case in Devon, of which he only knew confused snatches and vague newspaper headlines. But his friend's letter had intrigued him. "My dear Hastings, if your schedule permits, I would be very happy to share a cup of tea with you this afternoon. There is a story that needs patient ears, and one that won't judge prematurely." Hastings, as was his custom, arrived punctually, and although Poirot greeted him with his traditional courtesy and offered him his infallible bergamot tea, the air in the drawing-room was anything but light. No, Hastings thought, this was more like the prelude to a confession. "So, Poirot," he said after the first sip, "what's this mystery about?" "An unfinished painting, a curse, and a house in which, if I'm not mistaken, someone was murdered." "Technically, mon ami," Poirot replied, adjusting his shirt cuffs, "it wasn't murder. Not in the classical sense. Godfrey Ravencourt died of heart failure, perhaps precipitated by extreme emotional circumstances. What interests me is because he found himself standing in front of the stained glass window at that moment. And even more so, what was that stained glass window hiding that was enough to make him lose his composure?" Hastings looked at him, confused. Wasn't it simply an unfinished work? A portrait of Madame Annette? Poirot nodded. "So it seemed, but look closely, Hastings. Why would a portrait of her, knowing that her style was vivid, mature, and nuanced, show a child instead of a woman? And why did that child not have defined eyes, but merely vague lines, as if someone had tried to erase them?" Hastings shrugged. Maybe he ran out of inspiration or time. No. Evangeline Ravencourt never ran out of time or inspiration. She was a methodical woman, almost obsessive in her execution. Every detail had a purpose, even the silences. Poirot stood up and went to his desk. He took out the yellowed note Lady Elridge had given him, placed it in front of Hastings, and indicated that he should read it. "Did you find her in the house?" "A friend of the deceased entrusted it to me." "Read it." Hastings frowned and read aloud. "This is the silence that belongs to me. Don't look for its origin. Teach him to paint. It's the only thing he remembers without pain." "What the hell?" Hastings said, dropping the note onto the table. "Who are you referring to, Annette?" "I think so. But the important thing isn't who it refers to, ... but who wrote it." Anne Beckersey did not sign. Poirot calmly returned to his seat. "You see, Hastings, the mystery of Ravencourt Hall isn't one of death. It's one of identity. And the paintings Annette painted weren't homages. They were exorcisms. Each portrait was a fragment of something she couldn't speak. And when it came time to paint her own face, she chose the girl. She was before she had a name, and that girl was, I don't know for sure yet. But I've requested the records of an orphanage in Sussex. A remote lead. Someone named Beatrix Lonsdale, apparently related by blood to the Ravencourts, smuggled the girl onto the estate. The note was her safe conduct. And you think Godfrey discovered something, and that led him? It's not what he discovered. It's what he remembered. Poirot let the silence speak for a few seconds. "Imagine, mon ami, that your entire family has been built on a tacit pact of forgetting, that a daughter was brought into the home, not as a relative, but as a burden, that she was told not to ask questions, to learn to paint, and not to look back. Now imagine that a woman, many years later, begins to recover the threads of her memory through her own paintings. And just when she dares to represent herself, that fragment of truth appears. The girl without eyes." Hastings nodded slowly, and Evangeline saw that painting. She saw it while it was still fresh. and she was the one who asked that no one ever touch it, that it not be restored, that it be left unfinished. Why, Hastings? Why would that woman, so obsessed with perfection, leave her student's most personal work incomplete? Hastings thought for a moment, because the truth hurt him. Poirot smiled, but his expression was not cheerful, because the truth is involved. Are you implying that Evangeline knew where Annette came from? I'm hinting that maybe Evan Outshither, one who gave her away, not as a mother, perhaps, but as the guardian of a secret that needed to be buried. Perhaps her sister, perhaps a family scandal. I still don't know. But Evangeline protected that child, not with affection, but with distance, like someone who knows that loving too much can be dangerous. Hastings remained silent. The grandfather clock in the living room struck 5 with a deep chime, then another and another. Poirot stood up. A letter will come, Hastings, and in it, I trust, will be the missing name. Not the murderers, but the original victims. The girl before she was Annette. When I know that, ... The painting can finally be considered finished, even if no one paints it. Poirot looked at him gravely. Sometimes, my friend, a story needs no more details. Just justice. And with that, the great Hercule Poirot lit a gilded lamp, took up his ivory walking stick, though he didn't need it, turned, with the dignity of one who had already seen the shadow of the culprit, but not yet his face, stood gazing out into the fog through his window pane. Outside, London breathed like an old portrait, still unfinished. Chapter 16. The colour that wasn't on the palette. Ravencourt Hall seemed even quieter than before, as if the walls had absorbed Poirot's last words and now refused to return any echo. The morning was grey, but not opaque. A kind of grey that seemed to watch from the sky, heavy and expectant, as if it knew something was about to happen. Annette paced through the greenhouse. Her hands, stained with cobalt blue and burnt ochre, trembled slightly as she held a palette she hadn't used for 2 days. Her breathing was laboured, not from the cold, but from a tightness in her chest she couldn't quite name. Ever since Poirot had questioned her, something had begun to crack inside her. Not pain, exactly. It was more like a kind of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet were no longer marble, but paper. She stopped in front of the stained-glass window. She had avoided it for days, afraid to face that incomplete image that watched her, even with the eyes she didn't have. But that morning, for no apparent reason, her steps had led her there. The light filtering through the glass drew a murky circle on the floor. There, in the exact centre, lay a dried petal. She didn't remember bringing any flowers, and yet that petal seemed to have been left behind on purpose. It was the exact colour Annette couldn't find on her palette, a deep red with an almost black rim, like blood that has had time to oxidize. He bent down, he took it between his fingers and examined it. It was real, fragile, with the texture of dead velvet. I didn't find him in the garden, said a voice behind her. Annette turned sharply. It was Mrs. Renshaw, the housekeeper. Standing in her grey apron with her hands clasped together, she had the expression of someone who had witnessed more than she would ever say out loud. What do you mean, that petal, miss? It doesn't belong to our flowers. It's not from here, so. Who? Mrs. Renshaw looked down. It's better if he doesn't know. Sometimes objects that don't belong to us remind us of things we're not ready to remember. Annette felt a chill. She put the petal in her pocket and left the greenhouse without saying a word. Later, in her studio, she sat in front of the unfinished painting. She hadn't touched her brushes for weeks, but that morning something prompted her to lay down a new canvas. Not the unfinished portrait, but one that was still untouched, and he began to paint. He didn't think, he didn't sketch, he just let the colors flow as if they were coming from the center of his spine. The brush didn't so much graze as dig, layer upon layer, as if he were unearthing something. When the light began to fade, there was something resembling a face, but it wasn't his own, nor Evangeline's. It was a younger, more angular face, with eyes still undefined, but with a mouth set in an expression of silent wonder, as if she was seeing the world for the first time or remembering it from far away. "He looks like you," someone said from the doorway. Annette started. It was Poirot. He had arrived silently, his hunched figure silhouetted against the entrance, looking more like a visitor from the past than the present. "I didn't paint this," she said in a low, barely audible voice. "I don't know who did it with my hand." Poirot approached carefully, as if he didn't want to break the spell. "Sometimes, mademoiselle, memory manifests itself before conscience." He sat down opposite her, folding his hands on his cane. "I've received the files from the orphanage, St. Hilda's in Sussex, and I've found something curious." Annette didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the painting. A girl was admitted in 1913, with no name recorded. A woman named Lonsdale left her on the doorstep, along with a note: "Teach her to draw, that will keep her quiet." She was adopted by a family living near Ravencourt. After that, she disappeared from the register. But that family died in a fire 3 years later. Annette slowly turned her head towards him, and, "You think that I—" Poirot shook his head gently. "It's not what I think. It's what you're beginning to remember." There was a thick, almost tangible silence. "There's more," she added. "One of the orphanage nurses, before retiring, wrote in her diary that the little girl cried at night without making a sound. She only drew spirals with grey crayons, spirals and ... mirrors." Annette put a hand to her chest, as if something inside was starting to hurt. "I always hated mirrors, without knowing why." Poirot looked at her with a tenderness he rarely displayed. Then he stood up. "Tomorrow we will return to Ravencourt Hall. There is a room there that has been sealed for years. The East Wing, where Beatrix Lonsdale died. Lady Elridge believes it is empty, but I have my doubts." Annette stood up too, still with the petal in her pocket. She took it out and placed it on the table. "This color," he said. "It's not on my palette." Poirot watched him. "And yet, mademoiselle, he is exactly what we needed to see clearly." That night, while the house was asleep, Annette returned to the studio. She didn't turn on any lights. She just sat in front of the new painting, her face still eyeless, and picked up a piece of charcoal. He drew 2 ovals. Then he stopped, because what emerged was not a color, but a reflection. And in that reflection, for the first time, something inside her spoke a name, not out loud, not in letters, with a silence that finally took shape. Chapter 17. The East Wing and the Voice. Between the Fabrics. Dawn arrived without anyone at Ravencourt Hall being able to remember seeing it. It seemed more like the day had slipped beneath the door, like a formless mist, without sun, without certainty. A day made of suspended time. Poirot had been awake for over an hour, dressed with his usual meticulousness, his moustache immaculate, his shoes polished as if waiting to be judged. In front of the unlit fireplace in the main drawing-room, he reviewed in his leather notebook the names, dates, symbols, and fragments that still didn't fit. A pattern was emerging, like the shadow of one painting beneath another. At 8 o'clock sharp, Annette came down the stairs. She was dressed in slate grey, with a midnight blue scarf tied around her neck. Her steps were light, but her face was marked by something that wasn't exactly fatigue. It was more the face of someone who had begun to hear an inner voice she didn't know whether to fear or acknowledge. Poirot stood up when he saw her. "List?" Annette nodded. Lady Elridge didn't object to an inspection of the East Wing. She said she hadn't been in there since Beatrix's death, many years before. "We locked it up after the minor fire. There was nothing useful left," but her fingers trembled as she handed over the antique black key. The East Wing didn't have the gloomy coldness Annette had anticipated. It was rather warm, dusty, and filled with a silence that hadn't been broken in decades. The walls were covered with faded floral tapestries, and a faint scent of camphor and stale lavender hung in the air like a nameless memory. Poirot advanced first, stopping in front of the third door in the gallery. He placed his hand on the rusty handle. "This, mademoiselle, according to the original plan of the house, was Beatrix Lonsdale's private study. No one has entered here for 20 years. He turned the key, a sharp click, then a second, slower turn. The door opened with a sigh, as if the room itself had waited too long to be released. The room was smaller than expected. At the far end, a boarded-up window allowed only a slanted line of light to filter through between two wooden slats. On the desk, covered with a yellowish cloth, lay a pile of carefully arranged objects, a box of paintbrushes, a black velvet case, and what looked like a cloth-covered journal, but it was Annette who noticed the portrait on the back wall. Half covered by a hanging sheet was a forgotten painting, not a complete one, not a signed one, but its style, its strokes, its use of muted, swirling tones. It was unmistakable. "This is mine," he whispered, not knowing why. Poirot pulled back the canvas. The picture depicted a seated woman, her face turned toward the viewer, but her eyes were blurred, as if they had been forcibly torn out or deliberately avoided. The background was a garden, although the flowers seemed to be made of smoke. "No, mademoiselle, this painting was done by Beatrix. Look at the date, 1913. Annette stepped back. The same year she'd been abandoned at the orphanage. Poirot approached the dusty bookcase by the fireplace. He looked at the rows of mouldy books, one of which was barely visible. He took it out. It was a grey leather-bound volume, untitled. Inside, in small curved print, it read, "For the girl with the silent fingers, for the one who has no name, sometimes angels don't speak. They paint, and that's enough." Annette felt her knees buckle. She braced herself against the doorframe. "I don't understand." Poirot closed the book carefully. "Beatrix hid something, mademoiselle. Perhaps remorse, perhaps an act driven by love or shame. But this painting wasn't just a work. It was a confession." Annette walked over to the desk. She opened the velvet case. Inside was a brooch, a dried red camellia, protected under a layer of glass. "It's the same flower, the same color." Poirot nodded. "The same one you painted without knowing where it came from. The same petal you found in the greenhouse. It's not a coincidence. It's an echo dot." As Annette flipped through Beatrix's diary, the story began to unfold like a forgotten letter. "April 1913. My sin watches me from the cradle. I can't hold her in my arms, but I can't stop watching her paint. May I hid her. I gave her another name. She doesn't know who I am, but when she draws, I feel her calling me. June, a letter arrived. I shouldn't keep it. The name carries too much weight. They'll find him a new home, and I shouldn't interfere. August, the camellia fell from her hand as she left. It hasn't withered yet, like her voice. September, the fire started in the other wing. They say it was a short circuit, but I know it was my fault, and it's still burning. When Annette closed the notebook, her hands were stained with dust and emotion. She wasn't crying, she was just breathing differently, as if she finally understood that she hadn't been alone in her silence. Poirot looked at her with respect. Her mother didn't abandon her out of hatred. She hid her out of fear, out of structure, because of what she couldn't name then. Annette nodded slowly. And I've painted that fear all my life. That night, Annette returned to the studio alone. He lit a candle. He took down the incomplete painting, and in its place he placed the portrait of Beatrix. Then he took out a new, clean sheet of paper, and another portrait began. This time, it wasn't a woman with erased eyes. It was a girl, sitting in front of a mirror, and in the reflection, his mother. They both smiled, not because they saw each other, but because they recognized each other. Poirot, from a distance, wrote in his notebook, "Memory isn't an archive. It's a garden. Sometimes, to remember, you have to first uproot what was never meant to bloom. And sometimes, the missing color wasn't a color. It was a name whispered by a ghost's brush." Chapter 18. Lady Elridge's unspoken words. That midday, the light fell like faded velvet on the walls of Ravencourt Hall. It was no ordinary day. Something invisible, perhaps a newly discovered balance, or an ancient guilt that had found its echo, seemed to have changed the very air. The house was no longer merely a stage for buried pasts. Now it breathed, and it breathed with its eyes open. Annette hadn't slept. Since finding the diary, she had sat in her room, staring unblinkingly at Beatrix's notebook and the camellia brooch, now placed on a small, makeshift pedestal like a locket. It was, in many ways, the only object in Ravencourt that still had a heartbeat. Poirot, meanwhile, was restless. He had retired early to his room to collect his thoughts. In his notebook, he had written 3 words and underlined them twice: confession, inheritance, mirror. That same afternoon, Lady Elridge sent a handwritten note to Annette. It was brief. "Miss Lonsdale, please see me in the greenhouse at 5. There is something I must show you before it is too late. L. Elridge." Poirot, reading the note, narrowed his eyes. Then he looked at Annette. "Mademoiselle, it's time for the lady of this house to remember that walls don't always obey." The greenhouse seemed more alive than ever, as if the plants had been listening all these years. Dappled light filtered through the leaves, creating shadows that danced on the damp stone. In the center, seated on a rotillon chair, Lady Elridge waited with a blanket draped over her legs and a half-poured cup of steaming tea. Annette approached without saying a word. Poirot remained at a distance, pretending to observe the orchids. Lady Elridge looked at her as if she saw a person twice. "You know, don't you?" he said, his voice barely audible. Annette did not respond. "Beatrix, my sister, she didn't talk much about you, but she painted you. She always painted you." The woman reached out with a trembling hand and opened a small wooden chest at her side. Inside was a series of carefully rolled sketches. She spread them out on the glass table, drawings of a girl, sometimes asleep, sometimes with her back turned, sometimes simply an outline with a red flower in her hair. Annette recognized them immediately, not because she'd seen them before, but because she'd felt them. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she whispered. Lady Elridge looked away, because Beatrix forbade it, because ... I was a coward too. I always was. I preferred to keep the house whole rather than the family honest. I preferred a clean name to a dirty truth. Poirot then intervened, his voice softer than usual. "And what did you do, madame, the day Beatrix died?" Lady Elridge closed her eyes. Her hands tightened against the blanket. "I burned the will." A silence fell over the greenhouse, as thick as the humidity in the air. "I found it among your things," she continued, her eyes still closed. It was clear. She would leave the house, the paintings, everything, to her unacknowledged daughter, you, Annette. Beatrix had finally decided to name you, but that would ruin the Lonsdale name. It would ruin my position. I was the only formal heir, and the only one with the key to the East Wing. Annette said nothing. Her lips barely moved. "You burned it and hid it, the way you hide things. You're afraid you wanted," he murmured. Lady Elridge shrank. "Maybe, but ghosts don't forgive. Beatrix died with that portrait unfinished, and every time someone looked at her work, they also looked at what she didn't dare sign." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the sketches. "And you, madame, have been living under that gaze ever since. Is that not so?" Lady Elridge finally opened her eyes. They were red, but not from tears. "I've slept every night with the camellia on my pillow, a dried flower, like my silence." Back in the main hall, Annette sat in front of the unfinished portrait. She hadn't looked at it since hanging it in her room, but now it lay before her like an open question. Poirot offered him Beatrix's diary, opened at the last entry. "The painting doesn't have eyes yet. Perhaps when I dare to look at it head-on, I'll be able to give them to it. Until then, let it wait." Annette then understood what she had to do. He went upstairs. He took out his box of oil paints, and he began to paint. Not Beatrix's eyes, not hers, but new ones. Eyes that looked not outward, but inward, like mirrors redeemed by the act of daring to see. The next day, Poirot called everyone to the library. Lady Elridge, pale but serene. The housekeeper, Miss Byrne, who had served the Lonsdales for 40 years. The young lawyer, Horace Dench, recently arrived from London with a certified copy of the original will that, to everyone's surprise, had been anonymously recovered in the Dorking parish church. Poirot spoke calmly, without theatricality. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to condemn, but to make amends," and he showed everyone the new painting. The girl's face, her eyes, and in them, the woman looking at her from the other side. The lawyer read the clause, recognizing Annette as her legal heir. Lady Elridge didn't protest. She just nodded, as if the weight of decades had finally lifted her as she fell. Poirot looked at Annette. "Mademoiselle, the house is yours now, but not just the stone and the paint, also what lies between them." Annette, for the first time in years, smiled. "Then I'll start by opening the windows. Let the light in." That evening, Poirot said goodbye to Ravencourt Hall. Before getting into the car, he turned to Annette, who was waiting for him with a small suitcase. "Do you still want to go to Paris, mademoiselle?" Annette shook her head. "Not yet. First, I want to paint this house like it's never been seen before, not as a curse, but as forgiveness." Poirot looked at her with silent pride. "Then Ravencourt is in good hands, and the shadows have stopped talking." Chapter 19. The last signature. Autumn had arrived at Ravencourt Hall with soft steps. The leaves crunched underfoot with a sound that no longer seemed like a lament, but rather like ancient music, the kind you only hear when silence has been conquered. Every morning, Annette walked through the corridors with a cup of tea in her hands and an open gaze. She no longer avoided mirrors or closed doors. The east wing had been restored. The forgotten rooms were aired out. Beatrix's studio, preserved just as she had left it the night of her death. With one difference, there was now a bronze plaque. Next to the picture frame, Beatrix Lonsdale, unfinished portrait. Eyes by Annette. Poirot had returned to London, but not completely. His letters arrived every week, always brief, always full of questions, disguised as comments. Sometimes Annette answered them. Sometimes she preferred to let the echo do its work. But one afternoon, cold, windy, with the sky stitched with clouds like broken simsa, new letter arrived. Not from Poirot, but from the St. Etham Gallery in Mayfair. Miss Lonsdale, we received by anonymous mail a signed painting B.L., which appears to be part of a series that has been lost since the 1930s. The portrait is of a girl with a red flower. We ask that you appear in person to verify its authenticity. Annette squeezed the sheet of paper between her fingers. The portrait, the true portrait. Poirot welcomed her into his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, as if he'd been expecting just that visit for days. His moustache was immaculate, his Belgian tea served without question. "Ah, mademoiselle," he said, his tone barely concealing his excitement. "Finally, the last painting has come to light." Annette looked at him with a mixture of relief and distrust. "You knew that, right?" Poirot nodded delicately. "I suspected it when I read the final entry in Beatrix's diary. Maybe when I dare to look her in the eye, I can give them to her. She wasn't just talking about the unfinished painting, but the real one, the finished one, the one she didn't hang, the one she hid." Annette stared at him. "And who hid it after his death?" Poirot didn't reply immediately. Instead, he walked over to his desk and took out a folder with a folded sheet of paper. "The answer is not in what Beatrix painted, but in who she entrusted it to. In the gallery, the portrait hung in soft light, framed with austere simplicity. There was Annette, a young girl, with a red camellia in her hair and a look that belied her age. A look that seemed to know more than could be said. And below, in clear calligraphy, Annette, for when you're ready." Annette didn't cry. She couldn't. There was something about the painting that closed the cycle even before she could. Articulated, Poirot, standing beside her, took a deep breath as if preparing for a final performance. Madame Byrne, the housekeeper, was the one who found the painting hidden behind the library shelves, days after Beatrix's death. She wrapped it, protected it, and took it to the parish church in Dorking. Along with the will, Annette turned slowly. Why her? Because she was the only one Beatrix considered family. Because she'd been your nanny. Because she'd known the truth since before you were born. And because she was also afraid that the house would devour her too. So she hid the painting, until you forced her to remember. Annette felt something settle inside her, like a vertebra returning to its place, and the anonymous shipment. Poirot shrugged with a slight smile. A wordless confession. Silence isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's redemption. That evening, Annette returned to Ravencourt with a painting in her lap. Lady Elridge no longer lived there. She had retired to a residence in Bath, where, according to rumours, she spent her evenings reading mystery novels and writing letters to strangers. The house was now alive. Footsteps, laughter, even music could be heard. Annette had opened an artist-in-residence program. Painters, poets, musicians, even architects came for weeks at a time to work in solitude and leave something behind. Ravencourt was no longer a mausoleum. It was a lung. The painting was placed in the central gallery, in front of an east-facing window. The next day, as she turned on the hall light, Annette noticed something she had never seen before. A signature, barely visible in the lower right corner of the canvas. BL with your eyes, I'm no longer afraid. A month later, Poirot received one last letter. It came with no return address, blue ink and linen paper. Mr. Poirot, I can't thank you enough for teaching me to look, not just at what was outside, but inside. The painting was the mirror that denied me for years, and now I've crossed it. The house breathes me to Annette. Poirot folded it carefully. He put it in a box where he kept only two other things: an uninked quill pen and an old photograph of a woman with a camellia in her hair. He looked out the window. London was grey, as always, but inside something had shone, and that, thought Poirot, was the closest thing to true justice.